best day that we've had in quite a while, but I'm sure that you're in for a treat today. I'm Cheryl Raymond, Manager of Public Programs and Special Events at the Library for the Performing Arts. If you haven't already done so, would you please turn off all your cell phones and any other electronic devices you may have. And we are filming the program today. So if you are here with someone that you shouldn't be, you've been warned. We're pleased to have the New York Choral Society here with us today, and our very own George Boziwick, who is Chief of the Music Division here at the Library for the Performing Arts, will be part of the panel, and it is my pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Mr. George Boziwick.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. This is a very exciting program on the St. Luke Passion of James McMillan. The Music Division is happy to have the papers of the New York Choral Society, so this is a very nice privilege for me to be part of this panel today. We, of course, collect the musical activities not only of New York, but globally as well. We are the second largest repository in the country after the Library of Congress. The Music Division has over 2 million items, clippings, programs, archival collections, and of course, books and scores, unique items. We have Bach manuscripts, Mozart manuscripts, Beethoven, a lot of Mahler, a lot of Brahms, you name it. And that is what we do. So it gives me great pleasure to be the person who helped bring in the New York Choral Society archives. And without further ado, we are going to start our program with a couple of videos. So let's go to the videotape.
The musicologist and conductor John Butt wrote about Edward Elgar. Elgar's Catholic upbringing tends to be underplayed in most writings on the composer, but it may nevertheless be one of the most significant sources of his compositional character. Since the composition of The Dream of Gerontius, commentators have fallen over themselves in an attempt to paint Elgar's Catholic faith as weak or insignificant. Even his biographer, Gerald Northrop Moore, wrote this: "It is therefore perhaps inevitable that when he produced The Dream of Gerontius, a setting of a poem by a Roman Catholic cardinal, which explores various tenets of the Catholic faith, people should jump to the conclusion that his Catholicism underlay his whole life, but his faith was never that strong." This anxiety on the part of some has nevertheless been explained recently by the Princeton scholar Charles Edward Maguire, who says, "The popular negating of Elgar's Catholicism, both at his death and today, serves an obvious end. It makes Elgar's music safer, more palatable for a British audience. In essence, it creates an avatar for Elgar as the essentially English composer, beyond the reach of any of the complicating factors of partisan religion." In a Radio 3 essay at BBC Radio 3, is the classical music station in the United Kingdom, an essay on Elgar and religion, the pianist Stephen Huff said, "When he decided in 1899 to set Cardinal Newman's The Dream of Gerontius to music, he was taking an enormous risk. It was his first major commission, and his career was all set to take off. So to choose this deeply Catholic text in a country where papists were a suspicious, despised, and even ridiculed minority was to court disaster. Yet he went ahead, with total disregard for any possible censure or disfavour. So it's hard to believe that the words had no religious meaning for him at the time, especially as he was aware that his faith was an impediment to his career." If it is true that the dream of Gerontius is indeed a work of vision, as I believe it to be, then it was a vision burnished with courage, foolhardiness even, and gained singularly through a particularly defined religious tradition and sensibility. This was the kind of framework regarded as vital and necessary by T.S. Eliot when he outlined the conditions required for outstanding visionary art, and which had so eluded or had been so self-consciously rejected by, as he would no doubt put it, lesser seers such as Blake and his romantic self-delusionists. Elgar was to suffer for his courageous vision, as performances of the dream were banned as inappropriate. There's a word we hear a lot these days. Inappropriate in Gloucester Cathedral for a decade after the premiere, and performances in places like Hereford and Worcester were only permitted with large sections bowdlerised, with much of the objectionable Catholic dimension removed. It is thought by some that the vehemence of the reaction impacted greatly on the composer, even to the extent of him gradually losing his faith over the rest of his life. He may also have been seduced by the fame and praise which came his way in the wake of his more secular instrumental works, which turned him into a national treasure. Indeed, he was to become Britain's official composer, being made a baronet, awarded the Order of Merit, and appointed as Master of the Queen's Music. Proclaimed as quintessentially English, he became a totem of nationalism. Enjoying all that, why go back to the depredations of Catholic martyrdom? But it was from this religion of martyrs and saints that Elgar drew his most unfettered freedom to visualise a work of greatness. The etymology of the word religio is interesting, as it implies a kind of binding. David Jones says, the same root is in ligament, a binding, which supports an organ and assures that organ its freedom of use as part of a body. And it is in this sense that Jones, here uses the word religious. It refers to a binding, a securing. Like the ligament, it secures a freedom to function. The binding makes possible the freedom. Cut the ligament and there is atrophy, corpse rather than corpus. If this is true, then the word religion makes no sense unless we presuppose a freedom of some sort. This implies that supreme visionariness requires religion and theology. Now, there's an interesting and challenging idea. How would that go down in today's fashionable citadels of metropolitan bien-pensant culture? Michael Simmons Roberts explains, there's a popular view, influenced by Romanticism, that only the pure, unfettered imagination can produce the great work. Poets should not be religious or overtly political, or committed to anything much outside the poetry. Poets should be free-wheeling, free-thinking, free spirits, as if that meant anything. David Jones's implication is that the idea of the free-spirited artist is a myth and a delusion. The binding makes possible the freedom and opens the eyes to the vision. Major modernist composers of the last 100 years since were, in different ways, profoundly religious men and women. Stravinsky was as conservative in his religion as he was revolutionary in his musical imagination, with a deep love of his orthodox roots, as well as the Catholicism he encountered in the West. He set the Psalms, he set the Mass. He was a man of faith. And the other great polar opposite of early modernism, Arnold Schoenberg, was a mystic who reconverted to a practicing Judaism after he left Germany in the 1930s and in the wake of what happened there. And he pondered deeply on the spiritual connections between music and silence. And his later works are full of a Jewish character and Jewish theology, in fact. It's no accident, no surprise to me, that the composer John Cage chose Schoenberg to study with. John Cage, as you know, the American avant-gardist who was a kind of provocation to our culture in many ways and asked deep questions of us as listeners of music. His most famous piece is 4:33, which is 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence. But the original title for that work was Silent Prayer. And in France, of course, Olivier Messiaen was famously Catholic, and every note of his unique contribution to music was shaped by a deep religious conviction and liturgical practice. And the list of composers in recent times showing this high degree of religious resonance is substantial, covering a whole generation of post-Shostakovich modernists from behind the old Iron Curtain: Gorecki from Poland, Arvo Pärt from Estonia, Cancelli from Georgia, Sylvester from the Ukraine, Schnitke, Gubaidulina, Ustavolskaya, all Russians. Again, courageous figures who stood against the prevailing dead-hand orthodoxies of the day and the state atheism of the Soviet Union. And in my country, after Benjamin Britten, have come Jonathan Harvey, John Tavener, and many others. So far from being a spent force, as some would like to maintain, religion has proved to be a vibrant, animating principle in modern music and continues to promise much. It could even be said that any discussion of modernity's mainstream music would be incomplete without a serious reflection on the spiritual values, belief and practice at the work in composers' minds. But these spats between Eliot and Blake, between Chesterton and the New Age, between orthodoxy and majoritarian skepticism, are we looking at different types of transcendence? The search for spirituality seems ubiquitous these days, but in what sense can we call a spirituality made in our own image, to suit our own comforts, to fit our own schedules and agendas, transcendent of anything? Sometimes transcendence has to be fought for, like when Messiaen's music encountered the baffled sneers of its secular super-rationalist modernist audience and critics, who eventually won round and saw the full glory of the composer's genius and realised the music is the way it is precisely because of its theology. Like when Elgar composes a huge work which he knows will be unanimously rejected, but he had to face up to an unavoidable spiritual challenge, which for him, and indeed for all of us, will involve cleansing flames of purgatory. When people say they are baffled by what the Dream of Gerontius is all about, but are profoundly moved by the music, the transcendence, the revelation, and the understanding has already begun in their souls. The search for the sacred now it seems as strong today in music as it ever was. Perhaps that search now, as it was with the Dream of Gerontius, as it was with the theological rootedness of Messiaen's masterworks, as it is for any artist who stands out and against the fashions and tastes of the cultural bien-pensant, is the bravest, most radical and counter-cultural vision a creative person can have.
I suppose you could say that there's something about the mystical body that is inherently corporate. To collaborate in this way in a piece of music that goes into the passion of Christ might be regarded as theologically appropriate. That's not to say that it's easy or indeed predictable.
James, we're speaking here 2 days before the US premiere of your new St. Luke Passion. Now, this isn't the first time you've set the Passion narrative. You've set St. John's Passion narrative before. This is Luke. Tell us about the differences.
Everything's different. There are no soloists. The orchestra is smaller. Christ is sung by a children's chorus. All the other parts are taken by the principal chorus. It's slightly shorter, there is no interval. I think it was my intention to make the two pieces as different as possible.
Was that decision, or any of those decisions, determined by the nature of the texts themselves, or artistic, musical decisions?
Both, I think. It's a big change to go from St. John to one of the synoptic Gospels. There's a different emphasis in Luke, different message, different mood, different character of Christ even.
The composing of this has been slightly different, or perhaps very different in some ways from composing of the John Passion or your other pieces, in that you've been working with a group. 3 major meetings we had with the Duke Cambridge group, a group of theologians, writers, musician or two.
It really came entirely from the discussions we've had.
Tell us about that collaboration. That's an unusual thing for a composer. Composers are often thought to be fairly solitary creatures who like to do things on their own, preserve their independence, go away into a corner, as it were, and then come out with the great and grand work. We had 3, at least from our point of view, extraordinary and exciting meetings. Some reflections on that process and how you think the piece is different because of that.
Yes, you're right, it is an unusual way of working, and I can't think of many composers that would do this. And you're right, composers are these isolated figures. There's still that little bit of the romantic individual hero about being a composer, a hangover from the 19th century, which gives complete autonomy to the composer. I prefer to see my role as a composer as a member of a community, not just one community, but lots of communities.
I had an opportunity to respond to James McMillan's lecture to the Duke community about the composition. I raised the following points. The first one was, could he put his finger on the extent to which we had influenced him? It was very interesting because, to be perfectly honest, he found it quite difficult. And he says that when he's composing, it's almost like he's in a dream. And that when he interacts with people, it's semi-conscious, and therefore he wasn't able to pinpoint particular moments that we had influenced him, but he knew that we had.
The first performance in Amsterdam was in a secular concert hall. This performance is in a sacred space, or what we might think of as a cathedral, Duke Chapel. Do you think this piece has the potential to do something to bridge what some people would see as a kind of secular divide, or is that perhaps a distinction you're unhappy with?
I don't necessarily think too much about the divide, mainly because people who love music are very tolerant and open and knowledgeable about the Judeo-Christian roots of our musical culture. So when a secular audience, or even just ordinary secular people, go to hear their Bach passions, they do it with a deep respect of traditions. Many sceptical musical lovers still will use the word spiritual in the description of the impact that music has on their lives. So there's a lot that we can share.
I was really impressed by the way the presentation of Luke's Gospel, with centrally a children's choir, changed the whole experience of the Gospel. And I think it was deeply in line with Luke as the one Gospel which gives us Jesus as a child, as a 12-year-old. By using the children's choir, he brought that dimension of the opening of Luke's Gospel right through the whole of the Passion.
The point about the way that music presents theological ideas is it doesn't shove them in your face. It's not reducible to a certain kind of propositional line. That's the magic of it. Although I can see now how these theological ideas fed in, it might be better not to be too explicit about this and wait to have people say things, why did he start like that?
I value the way that ideas from others resonate with me. I write music because of other people. Yeah. I write music in order to communicate our shared humanity. So the dialogue and the sharing of ideas and discussion, for me, is a very important thing. I'm not a theologian, I'm not a biblical scholar at all. I'm not a poet, but I love being around people who are these things. If it wasn't for the group that was constituted These are the kind of people I would have sought.
Good afternoon. Thought-provoking words from Sir James McMillan. My name is David Hayes. I'm the music director of NYChoral. I am joined on our panel with Father Richard Dillon from Fordham University, and of course George Boziwick from New York Public Library here. My portion of this afternoon is to make a few musical connections to you that I have discovered within the piece. And one of the things that I think is so important about McMillan's music is that it is unquestionably music of our time, but it is deeply grounded in the traditions of music of the past, liturgical traditions of the past. He is somebody who embraces all of that came before him, and at the same time makes it somehow uniquely his own. There are references, musical references in this piece that range from Bach to Wagner to McMillan himself. He does an enormous amount of self-quotation. And I say that not in the sense of that he doesn't have any new ideas and therefore is recycling all our older ideas, but that he sees ways to make connections and contexts more apparent from earlier works that somehow then carry forward into his newer works. This creates, I think, a kind of a rather unusual unity in his body of work, because there is this constant self-awareness of what he has written before and how that impacts and interacts what he is writing at the moment, contemporaneously. So, from a very broad perspective, the structure of this piece is somewhat unusual for a Passion. Although, as Father Dillon and I had a quick discussion beforehand, it's perhaps less unusual in a way than I had originally thought, due to the text, due to Luke. But in the Bach Passions, and even in McMillan's own St. John Passion, there are moments where the narrative is broken to have contemplative poetry put in and reflections, and there are chorales, which allow the listeners to take in and absorb and contemplate on a more spiritual level the things that have just been talked about in the narrative. This is a much more straightforward setting of the scripture in the sense, as Father Dillon said, and I'm sure we'll elaborate on, Luke actually provides those contemplative moments as part of the structure of the narrative, so they're actually there, but not in the same way that we do think of when we think of a Bach Passion or something like that. The addition of the two framing sections, he sets a prologue, chapters 22 and 23 of Luke, which begins with the Passover Seder and of course ends with the end of the crucifixion scene. And he puts out on either side of those, structurally, he creates a postlude and an epilogue. A prelude and a postlude, or an epilogue. And that allows him to create some very interesting interconnections, because the prelude, he uses bits and pieces of the Annunciation story, and in the postlude, he uses bits and pieces of what comes later then in Acts, which is the resurrection story and the transfiguration and ascension into heaven. So he creates a rather unusual narrative for a Passion, in that these are elements of the story that we do not usually have as the central narrative of the piece. In addition to this sort of rather unusual structure, you heard McMillan talk about the fact that it is a chamber orchestra It is no soloists. There's a large chorus, adult chorus, which takes all of the narrative, which takes all of the characters, Peter, Pilate, all of the traditional characters are sung by the members of the large chorus, and the children's chorus, the unique addition to this, exclusively sings the words of Jesus. Something particularly interesting about that is that sometimes they're singing in unison, and sometimes they're singing in three parts. And there's probably some kind of clear understanding in McMillan's mind of the idea of the Trinity, the unity and the Trinity, and when Jesus is speaking, sometimes it's as the Trinity and sometimes it's as a unity. So there are those symbolisms and symbolic things that are in the piece. Beyond that, there are a number of motivic devices that he uses to give great cohesion and structure to the work. And I'd like to walk you through a number of these because I think that they make understanding the piece a little bit clearer. The first thing I'm going to play from you is something that is might not seem like it has anything to do with this passion, so to speak, but I will explain what it is after I play it for you. So here's the first excerpt. So you have the threefold chord structure that comes with this little rising motive. Dee-da, dee-dum. That is the prelude to Act 3 of Tristan and Isolde of Wagner. The motive, that particular motive, this dee-da-da-da, is referred to in many of the Tristan motive descriptors as the motive of the pain of death. An incredibly interesting connection if you think about this as something that is about to become in McMillan a very deeply embedded motive in the piece. One of the first times it becomes really obvious is in the prologue when the chorus is singing the text, "The kingdom of God has come near." And the orchestra takes off from that. But you can hear very clearly that there's an incredible connection that he's making between these two very distinctively different pieces. There's actually yet, and it only struck me recently because it's a piece that I've done many years ago, have not done for a while, and haven't actually listened to for a while. It's another earlier, much earlier work of McMillan's, probably one of his first famous works called The Seven Last Words from the Cross. And The Seven Last Words is for string orchestra and chorus. He sets the seven last words of Jesus, which are not all in one gospel. They're spread across different gospels. As I was looking at the libretto of it the other day, I noticed that 3 of the 7 last words come from Luke. And the first one that I'm going to play for you, and this comes from McMillan's 7 last words. It's the opening movement, which is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I think you'll hear a very intriguing connection between what we've just listened to and a work that was written in 1994, 5, 6, mid-90s. that scale 3 times, like in Wagner. Notice also the pedal pitch that you keep hearing sounded. I'll refer to that in a moment. So I'm going to fast forward now to the piece at hand. The same text, since it already became, obviously, it already came from Luke, when it comes in the Luke Gospel, we have a self-conscious reference by McMillan. And then something else happens, another piece of the drama. The second of the last words from Luke, he used a different translation in the earlier 7 last words from the cross, where in the translation he's using in the St. Luke Passion is, "Truly, truly, I tell you this today, that you will be with me in paradise," in response to the plea from the thieves, the thief who is being crucified to his side. The text is slightly altered. In the earlier version, it's "verily, verily" instead of "truly, truly." But I think you'll find that there is a distinct comparison between these two. Particularly listen to the violins. Now the Luke Passion. This is the thief saying, "Jesus, remember me," using the same motive that, "As Father, forgive them," which comes from Tristan. The same figure. The final word that needs to be connected from the 7 last words, the earlier piece, to the Luke Passion is the cry that Jesus makes just before he passes away, Father, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. In the original Seven Last Words, it's set in a somewhat different kind of way, but if you listen to the top soprano, you'll hear the melodic line, and you'll also hear how it devolves at the end into a very recognizable, yet again, chord structure. And there's that rising motive one more time. The pitch that you hear is the pedal pitch, which we also heard at the beginning of the Seven Last Words, which you're going to hear even more about, is an F sharp. This is Father, 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 forgive them. I'm sorry, into thy hands from the St. Luke Passion. This is how he sets it in St. Luke. But listen again to the top. So as you can see, the exact same idea, obviously now setting it for the children slightly differently. The meter is different, the context, but the connection is very, very clear into the way his idea of how these texts are set are essentially unchanged in the way that they speak to him. And he makes interconnections now between a very powerful early piece and now a powerful later work of his. There is another interesting motive that occurs. And if you listen to the opening of the St. Luke Passion itself, you hear this thing that the men begin singing, the do not be afraid. It's Maria, 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 do not be afraid. So here's the first of these settings. So, at the end of the first part, that's the end, in the beginning of the prologue, at the end of the first part, Jesus has been remanded over to trial, and the chorus changes that motive. It's the same motive, but it's done in a very different way, answered by the orchestra in a very, very highly agitated fashion back towards what it sounds like right now. But you hear the motive only in the orchestra. The chorus is in a kind of an augmentation of it. And the question here at this point is, who is being told not to be afraid? Is it Jesus? Is it us? It's an open question. It's not answered by McMillan or Luke. And that pitch is an F sharp. That little thing that they began playing in the orchestra will connect into the beginning of the first part. That becomes a major motive in the work. This that becomes a little major motive that comes in play into the second part. So that's the connection between the first and the second part. I want to talk for a brief moment, sort of at the end of this little travelogue, by relating Bach to McMillan. Many of you probably know the St. Matthew Passion. There is a feature that is widely known in the St. Matthew Passion as the infamous string halo whenever Jesus speaks. There's always a string halo around him. It's highly unusual for the time in Baroque music because, of course, it was usually secco recitative, just a continuo bass and an organ. And yet, the uniqueness in the St. Matthew Passion, Bach sets literally a cushion of beautiful string sound around the words of Jesus. So this is from the St. Matthew Passion. And you hear the halo. Initially in the Luke Passion, when the children are speaking the words of Jesus, McMillan also creates a string halo for them. Here's an example of the string halo that is around the children, and also at the very end, when he refers to the idea of the cup passing away from him, you'll hear that Tristan rising motive begin at the end of the children's sequence here. the string halo. I'll bring just passing reference to that in the piece, that every time when one hears this orchestra chord, this dwa-dum thing, I've dubbed it the scene change music, because McMillan brings it in consistently on a structural basis. Every time the scene changes, he announces it musically with that figure, not always exactly the same pitches and everything, but it's always that relationship, that figure. Finally, I don't think this needs much introduction. This is sung in the St. Matthew Passion throughout the piece. The Passion Chorale comes throughout the piece. But it's particularly notable for its appearance immediately after Jesus dies. The moment of Jesus' death is immediately followed by this Passion Chorale, sung very intimately. And one might expect McMillan who has taken other structural ideas from Bach, to have done a similar kind of thing. In fact, he completely does what we don't expect. As Jesus dies, the orchestra plays a mournful little sort of interlude out, but we continue following the scene where the centurion says, "Truly this was a man of God," and the women who had followed him from Galilee leave that place and wailing and beating their breasts because they saw these things. So at the moment he dies, it's actually been a few minutes before in the piece, there is just this little mournful orchestral interlude. But McMillan has a surprise in store for us, because what he does is, at that moment, as the scene has concluded and they're mournfully leaving the place of crucifixion, that is the moment where he brings O Sacred Head Sore Wounded in a chorale setting with all kinds of wailing and gnashing of teeth and the upper instruments around it, almost like granite in fortissimo, and in a way that seems to say, this is the power of the faith, because it is fortissimo. It is not quiet, it is strong, it is forceful, it is visionary in a way. A highly unusual way to approach this moment in the piece. ending, of course, with "do not be afraid." That motive coming at the end of that entire sequence. There then follows the postlude. If we had a little bit more time, I'd spend a little bit of time on the postlude, but I will say that the postlude begins and ends with a single F sharp. And I'll conclude by saying that I've puzzled greatly over the meaning of F sharp. It's interesting to puzzle over the meaning of a note. There is something about it that at some point maybe I'll ask McMillan whether he had something in mind by it, but the sharpness of that is what really caught my eye, not just the F-ness of it, but the sharpness of it. Because if we think about this idea of Augenmusik, in German we call it Augenmusik, in other words, it's music to look at. It has a meaning when you look at it, but not when the ear hears it necessarily. The sharp sign is referred to in German as the Doppelkreuz, the double cross. Not meaning you double cross somebody, but meaning the two crosses. And it may be, if you look at the St. John Passion of Bach, there are enormous amounts of playing around with sharps as symbolic meanings of chiastic structures, of symbolic meanings of the cross. And it may be that McMillan has picked up this, and that the F sharp itself has something to do with that idea, that there is something about it symbolically. But it actually is for the performers to have. It is not something necessarily that an audience would perceive, but it is something that becomes deeply personal to the performers as they embrace and explore how the piece is held together structurally. Thank you for your time. Father Dillon, would you?
Well, without your permission, I shared with you one of my forlorn strategies after teaching scripture for 35 years of forestalling boredom, and that is by giving out colored sheets. At least there's nothing that can foster boredom more than a ream of white sheets. And so every once in a while, I gave them out just to attract interest or to say, well, on the yellow sheet you see. Anyway, I think that many people outside of scripture study don't realize that the Passion narrative is, by the time Luke writes, a 60-odd year legacy. It isn't just an interplay of texts, because in the first century, most people did not write. And in any case, those who didn't have the leisure or the means to stockpile, which you had to do, materials for writing. And so much of the communication that the evangelist depends upon was spoken, at least prior to the Passion narrative composition, but also during the time the compositions were made. So you have in Luke's case a voice that is fairly well advanced along that process. He is like, and I'm kind of grateful for this comparison between the Bach Passion tradition and the McMillan, that Bach's arias and chorales, which provide pious commentary on the events being recited through the Passion text by the evangelist, there is a certain comparison with Luke's gospel, and I tried to show that. I mean, I didn't have that in mind, but now I'm pretending I did. By my differentiation of types there to show you first of all, the basic agreements between Luke and what Luke used as his template for the Passion, that is Mark. Mark, by common agreement these days, at least of contributing scholars, is the template that Matthew and Luke, for their parts, used. John less so, although John seems to have known the other texts, though he does not work off them as we think Matthew and Luke worked off of Mark. And so the rectotype, the regular type, is where he is working mostly off of Mark's text, but of course modifying it, because Mark was a fairly popular narrator, and therefore the texts are more rough-hewn, more ragged in some cases as far as strict narrative and style requirements went. And so Matthew for his part, Luke for his part, mostly they are independent of each other, Matthew and Luke, the larger synoptics. And so I didn't include Matthew's citations here because Matthew mostly follows Mark in the Passion narrative. Luke, less so, more creatively. And where you see the bold print, that's where you have material that is unique to the Lucan Gospel. And in some cases there, it seems to me you have chorales, if you can use a literary analogy there, chorales which are commentary on the events. I think one clear example of that is maybe 2/3 of the way down the page, the weeping women in Jerusalem. The women whom Jesus meets on the way of the cross, and to whom he says, as you remember, weep not for me, but for your children. Do not weep. Weep, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep. Weep not for me, but for yourselves and for your children. Now that is surely a commentary on the event that is based upon the event of 70 AD, where, of course, the Roman armies finally gained, after a 4-year siege, Jerusalem, burnt the temple to the ground, and expelled the Jews from the city. The Christian interpreters, of course, found in that event the bitter fruit of their treatment of Jesus. Well, there you have, weep not for me, but for your children. Clearly, it seems to me, a writer's reference back not only to the events of the Passion, but to what his generation considered to be the reverberations of that event. In other cases, maybe less so, but I'd like to point out, for example, that in the italic print, you have places where Mark's template is being followed indeed as far as the sequence is concerned, but interesting departures are made from it or additions made to it. And there I want to point out that in Luke's innovations there, or enhancements, if you want, you have an increasing tendency of the Passion tradition to portray Jesus as less and less the victim of the event and more the master of the events. And so those more questionable or more dire aspects of the Passion, of which he might not have been in control, for example, when the arresting band seizes him according to Luke, according to Mark, they move forward after Judas's kiss and seized him. The seizure is postponed until after the scene and after Jesus gets to speak his piece, and then they took him prisoner. They did not seize him. A moment of violence, you might say, that Luke avoids, and so does John. And so I point out there with underlining that in some cases these innovations have reverberations in John's gospel. That is a proof that these things are not interplay of written texts, but the developing tradition of the Passion, which tends again to rule out the dire, the gruesome, the grim aspect of the Passion story. The Mel Gibson aspects, for example, are not in the synoptic books at all. They are not interested in that, because that would be the portrayal of Jesus as a helpless victim, and that they are not going to do. Most clearly, John's case, where John in the capture scene has the soldiers or the guardians of the temple or whatever. They don't take him captive, he takes them captive. They fall on the ground before him. An implausible moment, of course, but one of these reflections. For the eye of the believer, he is not the captive, he's the captor. And the same thing happens in John's, of course, portrayal of the trial before Pilate, where after a while you don't know who the accused is, you don't know who the accuser is, unless you're a believer, of course, and then you see things completely the reverse of what they are. This is the dramatization in the Passion narratives, and that's what they were from the very beginning, drama. And that's what makes the musical portrayal of them so appropriate. Let's take further examples in that arrest story. Looking now at the parallel columns. One thing that, in keeping with this concern of the Passion narrative tradition, is that the kiss of Judas is in retreat after Matthew and Mark. Now, Judas's kiss was the strategy by which he was pointing out the person to take captive to these ruffians, these temple police or whoever, who didn't even know who they were taking captive. He was sent out to seize Jesus without any disorder and to let his followers go. And so Judas's kiss in Mark and Matthew disappears in John. Not there at all. Judas, you would think he was a supernumerary. And in Mark, in Luke, you have a memory of it when you have him, when he says, Judas drew near to Jesus to kiss him, as if that were still a meaningful strategy. But of course it won't be, because Luke brings the chief priests and the guardians and the elders to the scene, the very people who are not supposed to be there, you see. So he drew near to Jesus to kiss him, and Jesus said, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Obviously, you've got here not the recapture of the event itself, but commentary on the event. The commentary finally suppresses the kiss, because that would make him again the victim. And another thing that happens in this same trend of separating the misfortune, the gruesome aspects of the Passion, is that in Luke and John, and this they agree, the flight of the disciples, the kind of the departure of the disciples from the scene of the capture, after Jesus speaks his piece, they all leave him. And in Mark only, the departure of the disciples is so craven and is so cowardly that a young man who is following them, clad only in a linen sheet, when he leaves the scene and they grab at him, he leaves the sheet behind, he flees naked. Well, you're not surprised that the other authors did not pick that up, but that kind of illustrated how he was left alone by cowardly disciples who didn't support him. And there would be no room for that in Luke, because that's another aspect of Luke that you should know. Luke's composition of the Passion has the Acts of the Apostles in mind, because Luke composed not only the Gospel, but uniquely among the evangelists, a second volume which follows the course of the Apostles' mission after Easter and Pentecost. And then, of course, the Apostles are the main actors. And so, even in the case of Peter's denial, you don't have the buildup of that denial that you have in Mark and Matthew, where in a kind of crescendo, first of all, he denies he knows him to one servant girl, then he denies it to a group, and then he denies it with an oath and a curse. I don't know the man. Well, Luke eliminates that. Because after all, Peter is his main character in the Acts of the Apostles. He comes forward to be the leader of the apostles and the spokesman of the early Christian mission in the Acts of the Apostles, especially at the Pentecost and the subsequent temple speech. He's the speaker. And so that sort of disgraceful moment, which is not hidden, Peter repents of it bitterly, but then Luke adds, and Luke only, a touching prayer for Peter that is in, I hope, bold print here. The prayer for is up in the upper quarter there. Prayer for Peter and his denial foretold. Luke 22:31 to 34. Well, that prayer, quite beautiful. Peter, Simon, Simon, I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back to me, this is before the denial, when you have turned back to me, you will be able to strengthen your brethren. It's a touching moment, only Lucan, and so it's the bold print there, and it is a preparation for this fallible figure, this frail figure, for the role he is to undertake. It's kind of, I think, helpful for Catholics who are used to hearing about the supremacy and infallibility of the Pope, to remember that the person to whom he hearkens back, Peter, was a very, very fragile human being. His very fragility, the Master elevates him to his future role. And Luke tends to bring that out more than the others do. Perhaps John, and making him the sword wielder without any support from the other three voices. Anyway, that's the kind of development of which there are many, many examples. And if you have the interest, you can follow that list with the, what do they call them, the dots there, the bullets that they call them. And each of them is the sequence that Luke follows, following Mark, innovating on Mark, or substituting his own, or adding his own material. And the repentant thief is the most prominent of those, of course, toward the bottom in the bold print. And that is another choral instance in my mind. That is not, maybe it's a duet, but it's certainly a potent commentary on what the meaning of this event is for those who believe it and who accept it. And I'm sure I must be going over, am I, Dave?
No, you're good.
Anyway, I'm getting close to the 4 o'clock hour, so let me abdicate here. And,
Thank you, Father. Thank you. Before we take a few questions that may have been brewing and everything, I'd like to ask George to put his 2 cents in, so to speak. You may not know, you certainly probably know George as the head of the music department of the library here, but you may not know that George is also a very fine composer, and therefore I think has an affinity for other composers.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, indeed. As a composer, I ran across something that McMillan said, and it was about the idea of him being a vessel from another force, if you will, as a composer. And he says this: every time an acoustic idea is conceived, there is a metaphor, the idea of the incarnation, the Word being made flesh, being placed in the womb of Mary, divine inspiration, call it what you will. It is placed in the minds of men and women, and it comes to flesh artistically or in ideas. In other words, he has a sense that some of what he experiences is indeed divine intervention. And from a religious and philosophical, and of course a compositional point of view, he's very intrigued by this idea. But he goes on and he says, it is not a very fashionable claim to make in today's artistic climate, but maybe the avant-garde idea of tomorrow will be to talk about these things. So that really interests me a great deal, that McMillan admits to this kind of process that for him is part of the compositional process. And so much of the process of composers is what we like to call pre-composition. And that may indeed be part of what McMillan feels is being handed to him, so to speak, in both the pre-composition part and the actual composing part. But I still think it's a fascinating something to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do we have any burning questions? Yes, Ray. Yeah.
Many people have mentioned to me during the rehearsals for this production that they hear Scottish folk music in this piece, as well as the dramatization of the story. In what I've read online about McMillan, he does rely a lot on folk music, and I'm just wondering how you see that coming in to this story.
Well, as from a standpoint of working on the piece, I have long felt that there's a kind of a, depends on whether you want to call it specifically Scottish or more broadly Celtic kind of influence in his writing, particularly the decoration. There's a lot of decorative things, that there's a clear melodic line, and then those melodic lines are decorated in a very, if you know Celtic folk music, in a very kind of unique way to that. But it also, interestingly to me, is because there are these, we could get into a whole musicological discussion about the relationships between how, and a lot of people have done a lot of research on this, of how music from the East transferred itself from the lands of the East during the Byzantine Empire and made their way into Europe, and how that kind of influence then influenced the folk music of Europe. There is a sense that that some of the Celtic influence, that there's something that if you listen to sort of Byzantine music, or you can hear similar kinds of decorative things, even in the folk music of the East today. You can hear similar sort of decorative features to sort of quasi-improvisatory to the lines. So I think in a way it not only sort of grounds him in his Scottish heritage, but I think it also has a sense of, there's an archaic quality to some of the melodies that he writes, and they are distinctly Eastern in flavor in certain places. So I think that he's able to, by kind of embracing that heritage, he's able to find a way to sort of make us feel that the piece is hearkening back to an older period and an older time frame. At least that's what I hear.
Yeah, he definitely alludes to that, exactly what you said, the transmission of musical styles into the Scottish culture. And he uses that. And at least for me, the easiest thing to see was that he also mentions about bagpipe music and how many ornaments there are in bagpipe music. And if you look at the printed music, you see the lots of grace notes. And then you look at McMillan's score. Oh, look at all those grace notes. Wow, there it is,
Yeah. And somebody else? Wow, we explained it all to you? Life, the universe, everything? Yes, Peggy, sorry.
I'd like to ask Father Dillon about Luke. The Gospel of Luke, as I understand it, is very fixated, that's the wrong word, on the poor. Would you say that's true?
It's a theme. It comes up for the first in Mary's hymn. It's part of the reversal of fortunes that her child, the birth of her child brings. So you have, in the second stanza of that hymn, you have the rich he has brought down from their thrones and the poor he has lifted up, or I should never quote off my memory, not in this age anyway, but in other words, the mighty he has brought down from their thrones, and the lowly he has lifted up. The poor he has filled with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. That reversal of fortunes is, of course, a token expression. It isn't applied to actual physical circumstances. But to the extent that this child represents a reversal of human values and fortunes, the poor participate in that, as they have in the biblical tradition throughout. That where the poor are downtrodden and the rich govern, you have a certain prescription for social instability. And so even from pre-Old Testament times, you have the realization that the public authority had to stand up for the poor. The king had to be a defender of the poor. The poor, you have that poor law in Deuteronomy chapter 15 that the poor must, if you as Israelite do not have compassion for your fellow who is poor, God will hold it against you. So the favored position of the poor is reflected in the language of Mary's hymn, and it's carried forward in Luke as part of that reversal of fortunes that he follows through in the parables, in some of the episodes where Jesus fellowship with or communion with the poor is a measure of his authentic speaking for God, because God is the ultimate defender of the poor. That's an old biblical idea, and yes, it does survive in the Gospel of Luke. Not only survive, but reaches a certain, I wouldn't say it's a fixation, no, but yeah, it's one of those words I would come out with and I'd say, but something less than, but it's certainly a motif of the gospel.
Something else? Yes, Janet. Sorry.
Now this goes mostly on working consensus rather than certainty. Most people would place Mark first, and he writes really in the run-up to the destruction of Jerusalem. So during the Jewish War, as it's called, the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman army. That's in 66 to 70. Matthew shows the influence of the coalition of Pharisees and scholars to govern Jerusalem after Jews have been expelled from Jerusalem. They took up a community at the shore city or town of Yavne, and there they held they made an academy and a conference to define the legitimate parameters of authentic Judaism. And that's what led some of the sects, of which there were many, and the Christians one, to be excluded from, or to feel excluded from, the synagogue. Matthew shows the effect of that exclusion and some of its bitterness, even though he was, by most accounts, a Jew himself, even a Jew trained in Jewish scholarship. And Luke, and that would be, now we're talking with Yavne, we're talking about 84 AD or so. 80 is when the academy was formed according to its record in the Mishnah, or in the Talmud much later on. Luke and Acts are usually ascribed to the late years of the 80s or the 90s. Remember that you're not only talking about time sequence here, you're talking about geographical sequence, because all of these books are written in Greek-speaking areas, because Greek is the lingua franca of the Roman, the Greco-Roman world. And if you wanted your writing to be assimilated by any number of people, you had to write in Greek, and they did, some more eloquently than others. Luke does a fairly good job of it in both the Gospel and the Acts. He's a good atmospheric writer. He can write in the complexion of strictly Jewish society when he tells the story of Jesus' birth and so on, and records Mary's hymn, etc. And so that's where most people put him. In the wake of Mark's influence, doing differently with Mark in a Greek-speaking and probably in a Greek majority area of one of those shore cities in which there were vigorous Jewish communities, and where there were a good number of Jews, that's where we had our start, the Christian tradition. So places like Ephesus, of course, and Izmir, or now Smyrna in those days, Pergamon, those cities on the Aegean coast, they were trade centers, and they were places where Jews could make a good living, and did, and they often resented the inroads of this sect that no longer represented true Judaism to most. John, toward the end of the century, so we're dealing with, say, in round number 65 AD to 100 AD for the four Gospels, and therefore at some remove from the events. And the remove is visible in the influence of the tradition and its perspectives. Okay, the Klieg lights prevent me from seeing you, but I hope you.
Yes, sorry, Ronna.
How old were the apostles when they wrote?
I have no idea. See, those are details in which the writers are not interested. I would say that, just from a guess, that they were young men when he recruited them. And by the time he was himself executed, they were certainly not much younger than he, but he was only, in our round numbers, he was only around 30 at that point. So toward the middle of the century, they would be certainly full-scale adults, and they would be, if what you're driving at is John the evangelist, John the apostle, I would think not, because he would be rather a hoary old man by the time of this composition. Besides, he'd be writing in Greek, which, as a Galilean fisherman, he may not be fully equipped to do.
Actually, what I was most interested in is that in those days, if you just do the math, that makes the apostles, when they're writing these books, between 60 and
Yeah,
makes John 100.
that's right.
It seems curious.
I think that's a fairly good reason for thinking that the attribution of the books to apostles was part of the accreditation of them in a period when they were being impugned for their lack of style, for their lack of Greek language of a level of the classics and so on. And people would just, question their legitimacy on the fact that they didn't come from the horse's mouth. And so the tendency was to attribute the gospel to the person whose influence they represent. This is the wisdom of Solomon, written 900 years after Solomon. It's a period when pseudepigraphy, the false attribution of writings to honorary figures who maybe represent the wellspring of the tradition they represent, is common. Luke is supposed to have been a companion of Paul on Paul's journeys. The reason for that is that in those mysteriously intermittent sections of the Acts of the Apostles, you suddenly have a we narrator, a person narrating in the first person plural, just as mysteriously begun and just as mysteriously ended, mostly associated with sea voyages. Was Luke truly a companion of Paul, or is that a literary technique for the narration of sea travel? I have learned not to be too positive in these matters because it can come to haunt you.
Is there any consensus among the scholars that the books were actually written by the apostles, or more likely because of the time period they were written by someone who knew the apostles?
Who knew them? Well, Mark is supposed to have been someone who knew them. He is, well, depending upon the connections you want to make, he's the John Mark of the Acts of the Apostles, who was a follower of Paul for a while, but then fell out with Paul. Then according to 1 Peter, he was back in Paul's and Peter's good graces. I mean, it's a little confusing. But yes, I mean, there's testimony, but you wonder always whether the testimony is not promoted by the need to draw the authors as close to the apostles as possible. And when you have the kind of Greek stylist that Luke is, he could very well have been Paul's doctor, but there's always the doubt that is introduced by those who shake up classrooms by saying things that kids never heard before. So.
Lindsay, yeah.
You talked about how McMillan was paying homage perhaps to other settings of the Passion. Is there any sense in his composition that he's critiquing or otherwise commenting on other settings of the Passions?
I don't get the sense personally, from a musical standpoint, that anything is other than honoring a tradition that he is using. There doesn't seem to be a particular well, take that, Bach, I'll do it this way. I think it's very much those things that he takes, I think he takes consciously, and I think he does them to honor the tradition that he comes from, because he's a person who is deeply devoted to the tradition out of which he comes, and honoring that tradition and making a contemporary voice out of that tradition. So I would say, in my opinion, it's only commenting on other works and other structures like that to honor them. I don't know, do you feel different? I think we have one last time. Yes, Ellen.
Hi, this is something a little different, but it seems so interesting to me. And I finally found it so I can talk about it. In section 19, where the priest who starts the section in 6a of the Kings of the Gentiles, when I heard that the first time, I thought, wow, this is really evocative of something totally different to me. And I realized what it evoked for me was the literature that we sang when we went to Mexico in 2010. It is the figures of the da-dum, da-da-da, da-da, da-da-da. It is so evocative of that music to me, and I wonder if there's any link, any obvious link to Mexican folk music?
I couldn't necessarily pinpoint that. I'm not in the sense of that I blush to say I am not a huge expert in Mexican folk music in making a connection, but what I can say is that he's writing in a clear folk style. That these melodies are clearly derivative and derivative in a good way of folk traditions and folk styles and contours of folk melodies. And I think that the thing that I think generally about folk music is that there is this kind of weird thing that whether it's this tradition or that tradition or this tradition or that tradition, there is some kind of, and I hate to sort of say this because I'll probably regret it, but there almost feels like there's like an folk tradition, that there's some place it all comes from, and then it is translated into different experiences and different world experiences, but I think that there remain echoes in folk traditions that wherever it is that they come from. I do think that there's a kind of like an tradition in a way. Then maybe it's this Byzantine tradition or something that translates itself, because everything basically moved west. If you want to think about it that way, I mean, it starts there and it eventually goes and comes here and then goes south, and it kind of moves.
Yeah. It's very fluid, and the rhythms you described could also sound Eastern or Middle Eastern. If you look at an Irish tune like Star of the County Down, it goes through not only English-Irish iterations, but it becomes the hymn, I heard the voice of Jesus say. So, it's like a grab bag, I'll take this and I'll take that, and this is how the transmission works. Cultures intermingling, overlapping, taking some from here and some from there.
I'll just close, because we're running a little bit late, so I'll just close with saying that about this folk tradition and about hymns, which are part of folk tradition and everything. One of the loveliest things I ever heard described about how they're created was something that the late Robert Shaw said, was that these musical gems, whether it's a folk song or whether it's a hymn, represent music that has been lovingly crafted by generations and generations and generations of people, because every generation slightly crafts it and polishes it and makes something, so that these things that are transmitted to us represent a kind of a gift from the history that is why they are so important, why these hymns, why these folk songs are so important to preserve, because they represent the loving care of hundreds and thousands of years of people singing and transmitting them. Father Dillon, thank you so much. George, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.